our next talk will be presented by a duo of apocalyptic prophets. Coming from the lens of first, having helped define sticks and taxi standards and trained certs around the globe, he probably has more cats than he will admit, drinks more coffee than most of us combined, but yet he's only a human. Trey Darley. His partner in prophecy, he saw the rise and fall of bulletin boards, security researcher by day, hackaday, contributor by night. His passion for hacking knows no bound. You may know him by the handle Crypter Pedro Umbelino. Together, they come with a wake-up call against the Epochalypse. Please welcome Trey, Darley, and Pedro Umbelino.
Thank you so much. Can I get the mic? Everybody hear us? You good?
I'm good.
Pedro, it's good to be here in Belgium, isn't it?
It's awesome.
It's
my first time, and I'm loving it already.
So welcome to BruCON. I've been at almost every BruCON. There are many familiar faces here, but it's my first time speaking, and so it's a pleasure to show you this talk, which we've worked on for a year. So with that, this is an AI-generated Rube Goldberg machine. You can see there's some mechanical complexity and moving parts. This is a metaphor for our talk about time integrity, which is the glue that holds basically all distributed systems together in coherence. So, anything you want to throw on that?
No, looks
All right,
fine.
well, let's go. Glad everybody is not hungover, I hope, because we're going to do a little bit of history. So briefly, history of internet time. NTP was syncing machines as early as the early 80s, before ARPANET even switched to TCP/IP. This was one of the first demo use cases for satellite-based packet switch networks back in the late 70s when they were making the business case for the internet. It used, NTP did, a 32-bit unsigned counter, starting counting seconds from 1900. This has 136 years of range. We'll come to that in a moment. In the 1980s, that felt virtually infinite. Nobody imagined the same protocol still holding up the global internet 4 decades later. So NTP was the life's work of one David Mills here, who passed last year. Billions of machines still tick along to the design of his code. He passed, he left us this gift, but also even the most elegant protocols have somewhat finite horizons. And so we come to this question of the 32-bit unsigned counter, which wraps on the 7th of February 2036, instantly transporting many NTP-dependent systems back into the Victorian era. This is not science fiction. We're literally talking about substantial portions of our backbone, thinking it's 1900. What does that do to your TLS certificates, to your logs, to your forensics? So this happens 2 years before this sort of titular 2038 Epochalypse thing that you probably came here expecting us to talk about. But it's worth noting that 2036 snaps a lot of clocks back to 1900, a full 2 years early. So now we come to the question of why I didn't start the clock when I started presenting. Hang on a second. So, the revenge of C time, the time T struct. Computers don't count time like we do. They just count seconds, starting mostly since 1970. This is an illustration of 2's complement math doing what it does. So 32-bit signed T-time struct, unlike NTP, this is signed. That gives us a total of about 2.1 billion seconds that can be represented in sort of Unix epoch time, a value of about 68 years. On the 19th of January, 2038, this counter maxes out. Add one more second, the signed bit flips, and it goes back to 1901, December. This is not a bug. It's baked into the arithmetic of the time T struct. So this is a sort of Damocles hanging over potentially billions of devices, silently waiting for 2038 to snap back to 1901. And the blast radius goes way beyond Unix, as we'll see. It's called Unix time, Unix epoch, because that's where it came from. But in reality, this is an issue that touches C. If it touches C, it may inherit the T-time struct. That means operating systems, databases, file formats, protocols, even firmware and development tool chains need to be checked for this issue. So yes, the kernel may be patched depending on what you look at, but userland, tools chains, install base, that's where the real risk lives. So this Looks familiar, right? That's a rollover, right? It's just an iterative rollover, like CWE 190, right? Well, you're not wrong, I would say. Certainly it is an overflow. But you're also not entirely right, because when the shared clock that upholds consensus between billions of systems starts to shear, that's not just an overflow, that's an entire vulnerability class. So let's name this class clearly. The core problem is the scale to start with. Think about these tens of billions of systems. If they have a problem, somebody has to get on those systems. Wait, what happens to your multi-factor? Your authentication system may still work, but what about your multi-factor? Does that still work? So around this window of the rollover, there's a huge potential for our security mechanisms to actually go into a state of dysfunction and lock us out. Here's a real kicker, there's almost no coordination. There's almost no awareness. I've been looking at this issue casually and then more intensely for almost a decade, and it's striking how much silence there is. Bugs you patch, vulnerability classes require coordination. So 2038 is not just like Y2K. This time it's different. So in a nutshell, and we're going to hand out the deck, we'll make it available later, there's notes, there's references, you can look at this, I won't. But a quick 30-second, where did this come from? So it started off, as near as I can tell, this emerged around 75. I found some evidence. This way of representing time was pragmatic in the disco era. C did it by default. Who here has ever written time-related code and made mistakes? It's easy to do, and that's why you try to use libraries and reference implementations, or you copy pasta something, because it's really easy to screw it up. And so basically what happened was this was a design pattern that started off as a C struct, and then it got copied around by clever developers who were trying to close out their KPIs and commit and push on a Friday night and go have a beer. Disco era semantics stuck with us, and a C struct has impacted our industrial landscape. So this gives you a mental map. There's some known knowns, like this we're calling it a final warning before 2038. Then we have another one. We think this is the big one. Some say this one. I don't know. Then we have some other stuff that's coming. Known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. This is a class of problems that has to do with short-sighted coding assumptions that live in longer-lived code than the developers expected. They don't all land on the same day, but interestingly, they're not random either. They tend to cluster right along the bit width boundaries, and then you see failovers. So I don't know if that's a clue or not, but I'd say once you see that, it's helpful. So stop. It's good that it's not after the party because we might be hungover. And I was just trying to flash through some bit math real quick. Try explaining this to your board. The thing is, Y2K had a very easy elevator pitch. You know those like page-a-day calendars that you tear off? That's like a gift you give somebody at the office that you don't know what to give. You know what I'm talking about? That's all you needed to explain this to a CTO or the board. This is what happened in Y2K. It was just a calendar rollover. For the apocalypse, you need to understand epochs, signed versus unsigned math, dependency chains, protocols. Your board is checking their phone. This is not a question of technical competence or intellectual ability, it's cognitive load. Everybody has to deal with a lot of shit these days, and if you start talking all this math and then you say the words 2038, they're not listening, because that seems impossibly far away. So the thing is, if our leadership cannot internalize this risk fast enough, they cannot advocate, they cannot budget, and we cannot coordinate. And that is why right now, inertia is winning. So I asked myself, is there a precedent? I'd like to say, first of all, this is not just me speaking here today. What I'm sharing reflects decades of conversations with people who were generous with me, people smarter than me and more experienced who helped me get here today, just as we're trying to help you. So I've tried to follow the pattern, to gather the threads, to stick to the data as we both have. We do reason from first principles in some places because this is a big problem space. You can't just go buy a book for dummies on this. Somebody has to start somewhere. So if you see gaps in the numbers, in the reasoning or the assumptions, please challenge them. Help us make it better. Don't just criticize, help us make it better, because we're trying to establish a baseline measure for this problem space. But when you see a systemic problem like this, you say, did something like this ever happen before in history? Is there any precedent? Did people solve this issue something like it before? What kind of playbook could we copy? Oh, yes, IPv4. This is an interesting case where we all collectively said, whoops, here's a 32-bit number that we wish we'd made 64 bits. So instead of just making it 64 bits and shipping IPv6, though, the standards committees knew this is going to be fielded across a growing installed base. This may be the last chance we get to rev, IP, so we better work on it extra super hard to make it foolproof for a Star Trek future. And so it spent a long time in committee. It got a bunch of extra fancy stuff clamped onto it that's, different from IPv4. We didn't just make the address field bigger, but what's interesting to note is on the scannable side of the internet, in front of your firewall and not behind it, there's about 50% of IPv4 today, and still I hear from many in large enterprises that if they try to roll out a pure IPv6 corporate network, for about 5% or more of use cases, there's still a dependency on IPv4 and they can't switch to IPv6. So this is interesting. There's also some differences, like the economic drivers around IPv4 address exhaustion are different. We can have a sidebar on that, but as a metaphor, we have a 32-bit number. We wish we would have made it better. We have to touch a lot of systems. It takes time to touch a lot of systems once you have even consensus on how to touch them. So let's go a little bit further into this question of standards, because this is an interesting angle that doesn't get looked at as much at hacker conferences, and I would say that standards would be better if there were more hackers helping make them. RFCs, like IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force RFCs, who here doesn't know what an RFC is? Please don't raise your hand because that would be embarrassing. RFCs are the foundation of almost everything we do, from networking to timing to data exchange, but it's been growing. People go and do a master's degree, people go create a new protocol for their company or whatever, just gets codified in an RFC. So not accounting for the AI vibe coding effect, which makes it very easy to churn out an RFC these days. Not accounting for AI, we're projecting a growth of roughly to 5x from the 99 point to the 2038 point, which that seems like a reasonable jump, doesn't it? But each one of these is going to need to get checked for this sort of design pattern of that 32-bit struct time representation that we talked about coming from C's time T, excuse me. Like, it's not everywhere, but it's a lot of places, and there's not really anybody who's systematically checking this stuff. And it's more than just the IETF. There's a whole global bazaar. You have international standards bodies like the ITU or ISO, European things like Sensenelec or ETSI. US has ANSI and NIST. There's stuff from any industrialized country has something. There are industrial verticals like GSMA or 3GPP for wireless. There's stuff for satellite. There's so many standards bodies. I've been trying to get a list of all the world standards bodies for like 3 years, and I don't have a good one. This is a big challenge because all these standards bodies import something from over here. So like if you have 5G, does 5G use DNS? Yes, it does. That's from a different standard body. But does it have its own idea of how DNS is used? Yes, it does. So these assumptions create something like an interlocking dependency tree where we're going to have to go and check each of these, potentially a domino in this 2038 problem, but we don't know how the rows line up yet. Tens of thousands of potential fault lines. So there's another way to look at this naively is like, so how many basically computers do we have in Y2K and how many do we think we're going to have in 2038? It's hard to make an apples to apples comparison because product categories have shifted. There's a lot more IoT. There's a lot more connected SCADA. There's not so much mainframes as we used to have, but still a lot. The categories have changed. But look, there's consensus that there's a lot more computers than there used to be. And whether you take a 100x multiplier or a 600x multiplier in some kind of more IoT embracing model, there's still, whether it's 100x or 600x more connected Turing nodes that may have to get checked for 2038 than there were in Y2K. Just at a naive read, this is a bigger problem, a much bigger problem, because we don't know how big the iceberg is under the water. Now, this is AI generated. We're trying to stick with data and numbers and facts insofar as we can. So we said, what's a useful heuristic we can use? Pedro's going to go into the data and the scans and the heuristics, but he's given me this one to talk to, so by golly, I will. Look, it's a graph. And look, there's a red bit that says not safe. You know what that represents? We said, what's a good proxy for unsafe time? Oh, what about NTP servers that we can identify that are going to have a rollover issue in 2036? Maybe that's a good heuristic. And so guess what? You can't see everything, but of what we could scan that exposed the right kind of metadata, about 1/3 of it still has this issue many years after NTP rolled out the fix for this. So that's slightly concerning. It's important to remember that in many environments, NTP is treated like gospel truth. So if your upstream lies, this can have real serious downstream impacts. So we can't really see what's behind the firewall very easily. There are some techniques. I'll save that for Pedro. But it's worth noting also, if you say this is not an issue, take off your tinfoil hat, Trey and Pedro. Go tell that to Sweden, I would say. A couple of years ago, who here knows how the internet is governed? Have you heard of a regional internet registry? Anybody heard of ICANN, maybe? Right? They handle the DNS system. So when it comes to more lower level governance, like address assignments and so forth, IANA is at the top, and then you have the regional internet registries. So there's one for Europe and the sort of Mediterranean and the former Soviet bloc called RIPE. I was at a RIPE conference. They're great. If you get a chance to go to a RIPE conference, do. There's a cool security scene there that's very different from ours, connected to the network operator community. But I saw this talk a couple of years ago from an operator in Sweden called NetNod. It's one of the big operators there. And they were talking about this whole terrestrial-based, optical, hardened, time synchronization network they'd rolled out for Sweden. They had developed a whole new protocol called NTS, which is a drop-in, better, secure replacement for NTP. NTP, some versions are vulnerable and some versions are not. NTS isn't vulnerable, so having a drop-in replacement where you can say, I got no NTP left, I'm good for NTP, that's a pretty good strategy, I think. I watched this talk, and I was going like, why did they do that? Why did Sweden do that? Oh, why isn't everybody else doing that? In fact, they even developed custom FPGA cards that you can drop into, say you're like a high-frequency trader or something, and I don't know, you need really high quality time source, you can just plug right into the backbone of the national system, which they have a funding model, I might add, that embraces this as infrastructure. There's, research, regulator, and private industry represented in this consortium, and they tag 1 part per million of national ISP turnover to pay for this. So there's an example. I would say it also validates that there's a problem space here, and that we're not just making this up. So before I hand it over to Pedro, I just want to leave you with this. What happens when we take 25 or more years to try to make one 32-bit number bigger in one protocol, get 50% done with that, rolling that out, and then we have to go and do sort of a similar thing across potentially tens of thousands of protocols, formats, and standards, and check a bunch of code in about a decade. So does it still feel far away?
Thank you, Trey. Check, check, check. Thank you, Trey. So who here thinks, wow, the FUD is strong in this one? Show hands. Well, one. Well, you are easily convinced. Well, so I was thinking the same thing. Like 1 year ago, I was at Heklu. I was watching Trey Darley's talk. It was a lightning talk on 2038. And I was thinking about FUD, right? Is this as pervasive as we think, as he said it is? And I was getting concerned. And my takeaway from that short lightning talk was, he said something like, look, Y2K was 25 years ago. We only have 13 left. And, well, first of all, I felt old because I knew what he was talking about. And then I realized, okay, 13 years is not that much if this is everywhere. And I went home. I was working on industrial control systems back then. I was doing some research. I test those systems. And immediately one of those crashed. Maybe I was lucky. I tried another one. The other crashed too. Okay, that's odd. I went to my smart TVs and I tried the same. Half of them also crashed. And then I started to get concerned, right? I called Trey 1 year later. Here we are. So please entertain my FUD formula here. I state that fear is actually a compound of uncertainty plus doubt, right? But in this case, in this special case, physics don't negotiate. Like, time goes forward, it's unavoidable, so there's no doubt. The rollover will happen. It's 2038, if we all here, you can see it. So doubt is zero, and then fear just becomes like this uncertainty. Uncertainty about what? Well, we are not sure what's going to fail, how hard those systems will fail. We're not even sure where they are. Are they buried in our infrastructure? Like, where are they? We need to figure that out. Anything that still uses, the time T, anywhere in its stack can fail. Like Trey was mentioning, it's not just 32-bit kernels, old ones. Like 64-bit kernels can actually have like dependencies on user land, on libc. Think about drivers, think about database timestamps, file formats, protocols, and there's a lot of things that might fail. That's what makes this problem really hard. So fear by itself, it's not a bad thing if it's a motive for informed decision, right? If you're paralyzed by fear, then that's bad. Now, a deer hit by headlights might freeze and get hit by a car, or it might start running and save its own life. So I say that we are facing this kind of, it's a predictable digital disaster. And it's slow moving, but we need to act now because we are already seeing the headlights in the distance, and time goes by so fast. So I don't think this is a hype. I think the FUD is really simplified. It's uncertainty. And with that basis, what I said is, okay, we need to solve for uncertainty. That helps us reduce fear and understand the problem better. And there's this huge discovery challenge. How do we solve this uncertainty? Well, we just need to figure out what's vulnerable and where they are. So that's easier said than done because it's a very complicated issue. So we start thinking about, okay, which approaches and methods like we can use. This is some examples. There are surely more. We start thinking about, okay, what if these devices are still connected and online? Then we can use like proven methods like scanning, fingerprinting. If they're reachable via the internet, maybe we can find where those are. So that's a good thing. If they're using the internet, but they're not exposed in a traditional sense, let's say a smart TV, it's a client-side thing, but there's also metrics, like the vendors know which TVs connect to their update servers, and there's other methods that I'll go into. Then if it's not connected, just download the hardware specifications, try to understand the target operating system and the architecture. The same goes for firmware. Firmware is great. You can analyze it. You can try to derive an SBOM out of firmware. You know the target architecture and operating systems. You can try to understand if there's time T dependencies there. And then look at software repositories, RRC specs, dumps. There's a lot of things that you can try. And in the next slides, I will share some of our explorations. We've done more, but then the talk will just get too big, and we are rushing. So some examples. Server-side example number one, SNMP. I'm not sure who here remembers SNMP. I was a pen tester in the other life. Finding one of those systems was great because you get a lot of information, and you can just go run to exploitdb or something, find the correct exploit. But SNMP gives a lot of information about systems. That's what it's designed for. Sadly, nowadays, version 3 is, well, it's not very talkative unless you have the username and password. But still, as Trey mentioned, I work at BitSide, and one of the things that I like to do there is that we have huge amounts of data, and I get to play with all that data. I really enjoy that. We have our own internal scanning engine. It's like our internal Shodan. It's like over 725 million observations on stuff that we find online, and I can search that. So I went searching for SNMP. So what's there? And I found like 15 million samples last month. Around 600K had like versioning information that we can try and derive the architecture. We were able to do it in 400K systems, and this is kind of what it looks. Sorry, there's a bunch of charts here. On the upper left side, you'll see that of those 600K, roughly 200,000, we weren't sure. 200,000 were 32-bit and around 200,000 64-bit. There's slightly more 32-bit systems. Will they fail? Likely. Can we know for sure? No, we have to go and test. We have to understand each version and test, and that's a huge task. Sometimes, though, you can develop very high confidence probes. Of those, 20,000 were exposing the exact Linux kernel version and the architecture. And that's something else. Now you know the exact version, and you know in which version of the Linux kernel, like the 2038 rollover fixes were implemented, and with the architecture you can join it together and have a really high confidence probe. And strangely enough, of those 20,000 systems, 14,000 were vulnerable to the rollover. Something will happen to those systems. Now, depending on what they control, it could be serious. Anyway, there will be like geographic tendencies, and depending on the technology, the protocols, the devices that are used by each country. But the main point here is that this rollover will impact everybody in a slightly different way. Another server-side example, well, which is the classic one, maybe in a slightly ironic fashion, is NTP, right? We use it to gauge the exposure rollover of 2036 and the chart that Trey mentioned. But this can also be used like SNMP. NTPD has this mode 6 queries. You can use it to query version information, and you can query the processor type, the operating system. So you get a lot of information like you get for SNMP. So what do we get? Well, of the 200,000 systems, we saw around 1/3 is vulnerable to the 2036 rollover, like Trey said. But interestingly enough, almost 2/3 of existing servers, so this new chart, almost 2/3 are still running 32-bit. So were they fixed for 2036 just to fail 2 years later? We don't know. We have to go. We have to test. We have to dig. Right? You see that map? So it's red means 32-bit. Red is bad. Belgium has a lot of red. We have to fix that too. Okay, moving along from the server-side examples and talking about ICS and more vulnerable devices that control like parts of our critical infrastructure. I was back then and last year I've been focusing on ATGs. If you don't know what an ATG is, it stands for automatic tank gauge. It's a device that measures, fuel levels in big gas tanks. So you might be thinking, okay, gas stations. Yes, it's the main use case, but whenever there's a big fuel tank that is used for power like a backup generator, think about military, hospitals, airports, your data centers, right? So those have to be used. They control not only the fuel levels and other parameters, but they also run like leak detection tests. It's important for environmental concerns, but also compliance. There's huge fines if they don't work. And how can we try to measure this? Where are these devices at scale? So we know for sure that around 10,000 are exposed and online. We know that the US has around 120K gas stations, and there are over 1 million gas stations in the world. That's in the internet. How many ATGs are there? We don't know. It's in the millions. 10 are exposed. The other entire surface is not. Why is this important? It's important because these systems have been around for a while. They are mostly old systems. There are new ones too, but they are running old protocols too. So there's a lot of legacy. They were invented way before the internet. And so there's this potential for failure. So I was testing those systems. Those were one of those systems that failed when I was doing the first test. We have some CVs already. So, but the interesting thing here on those types of devices is that I tested different devices, brands and models, and they have like different code bases. So the source code is completely different, but they both fail kind of the same way. So there was this remote administration failure. So the users and the operators can no longer log in because the authentication tokens were expired. They were back in the 1900s, right? So you can't log in, you can't control the device. The leak detection doesn't work. That's a problem because, first of all, if there's leaks, it will be important to know, and then there's, fines. And the logging gets all scrambled. So essentially you get an unusable device that controls, well, a big gas tank. That's concerning, right? There's this potential too for a persistent denial of service. So what I'm saying is that come 2038, if these devices are still widespread, think about like a synchronized colonial pipeline at the worldwide scale where everything gets screwed. So it's concerning, right? Okay, moving away from server side, let's go to client side. Why do I mention TVs? I mentioned smart TVs. Well, first of all, we all have smart TVs, and for me it was quite natural to run to my living room and test it, see if it crashes. So a smart TV is like a computer that doesn't look like a computer. And it supports all kinds of sectors across our society. If you think about it, it's not just my living room, it's hospitals, it's airports, it's wherever there's big control rooms. Nowadays everything is smart. And they are usually not directly reachable via the internet. They are not usually scannable. I say usually because I figured out last week there's a lot of them online too, so over 200,000. Anyway, but how can we fingerprint these types of devices if you think about it as a class of devices, like client side, right? So the vendors know the models, the vendors know the update servers, but interestingly enough, the ad companies sometimes know about the models too because they serve ads on our TVs. And funnily or not, malware also does. Malware that sometimes comes pre-installed with those TVs, it knows the models. Why do I speak about malware? Because I also happen to work at a company that runs one of the largest sinkhole operations in the world. This thing is massive. We're talking about billions of data points. And I, was talking to an engineer there and asked him, okay, how do I search for TVs in our sinkholes? Do we have that? Turns out we do. We have some old advertising domains that are not used anymore. And we have a lot of malware that I learned comes pre-installed from some Russian TVs, and we have sinkhole those domains, so we get telemetry. And last week, I was doing some basic search. I found like 127,000 TVs in the sinkholes, just a small sample of TVs. There's a lot of them vulnerable that I know they're vulnerable with high confidence because it's the same models I have at home, right? Why do I talk about smart TVs? We need to start looking at this systems that are computers that don't look like computers. And we take for granted, and we don't think they will fail, but they might fail, right? Strategy Analytics, I think, says there will be 1 billion smart TVs by 2026. Wow. Where will they be? Okay, these examples could go on. This slide says something like, hey, my notes, I can see a lot of you have laptops, so if you have a laptop, you open up your terminal, please. We do an experience, run this command, find newer modified time, some date in 2039, and please raise your hand if failed so I can see, and you can do it while I'm talking. So this is a small experience if you have a laptop, or if you want to open your laptop. Anyway, measuring this at scale is very hard, right? It's a challenge, and we will have to accept that we are going to be unable to map out where all these devices are and if they were going to fail with high confidence. Not to mention the fact that the number of devices that exist that are not connected, that are not online, that are very hard to find just by searching via the internet or remote searching will be also a very, very important challenge. So to have a more accurate insight on the scale of this issue, we can try and correlate different data points in some heuristic fashion. For example, we know that operating system vendors, they have telemetry and statistic about the architecture where they install their own operating systems. And luckily, Debian freely shares those statistics. It has a package called Popularity Contest. I found it a funny name. And they published these numbers. Why am I talking about this? Well, this goes back to 2004. You see the different architectures. So when you're scanning stuff that you cannot immediately figure out if it's a 32-bit or 64-bit system, what's the likelihood of being vulnerable or not? Look at, for example, that FTP fingerprint string. It was compiling back in 2003. So 2003, the likelihood of being a 32-bit system is high. So we can use this as a sort of a heuristic and a reference for how likely it is for a system to fail when you're unable to develop like a high confidence probe. Now, testing devices themselves instead of code is actually quite important because many tests that we do, like testing a specific library, they don't simulate a real-world overflow because many times those systems are all interconnected into a big system. And we need to figure out what's the cascading effects, where everything fails, right? So my suggestions for devices that you can test in situ would, if you own a nuclear submarine, you can go and test your own nuclear submarine. Maybe you don't own one of those, but there's other toys you can test. And I won't read the list, but I just split it in two because the red ones, I tested some of them myself and I found issues in almost all of them. Yes, cars too. Now, I'm almost over in my part, but what I want to say is that time is a root of trust. Okay? We have a lot of assumptions about time, and who controls the clock controls like the systems, right? Think about it. Think about certificates, think about cryptography, think about our consensus about things. They all, almost all aspects of our digitalized world is time anchored. We need to agree what time it is to make this work. Think about TLS. TLS will break. I'm sure we all use a browser and see a pop-up say certificate expired. If there's a rollover, TLS will break. If you're using a browser, you'll see that pop-up. But if it's just the update mechanism in the operating system, maybe you don't see a pop-up, maybe there's a warning, maybe there's not. If it's machine-to-machine communication, there will be no pop-up, there will be no warning, it's just failing silently. And that's a problem. But what I'm really here about, and what I want to say today, is that this rollover vulnerabilities that can happen today, we don't need to wait 13 years for them to happen. Why? NTP is not secure. GPS is not sovereign. Right? Time manipulation is easy. It's inexpensive. So think about GPS spoofing, NTP injection, manipulate file format fields, protocol timestamps. This is real. We tested all those methodologies in our labs, including GPS spoofing for time. It's fairly cheap, and the point is systems will fail, sometimes silently, and we don't even know where they are. Right? So imagine if Subtle Snail is like this. I try to depict Subtle Snail there. So they are an Iranian group that are targeting telecoms. They were all over the news last week. Imagine they control large parts of the ISPs and they start to push down NTP, spoofed packets. So what an easy, cheap, and potentially disruptive attack they could make. We don't know what will fail. We don't know where these systems are. Now, before I give it back to you, Trey, if you feel this kind of itch, this urge, okay, I'm going to go back home and I'll start testing my TV and my watch and my fridge and my microwave, everything's connected and has a computer nowadays. You might bump into some issues, but I want you to remember like two major things. Setting the clock is like picking the lock, okay? Don't do it if it's not yours, and don't do it if you depend on it. Because we never know when the crashes, are permanent. So, but think about this second thing. If a device won't let you set the day past, January 19, 2038, at 3 o'clock in the morning, 14 minutes, 7 seconds, UTC, ask yourself why. Why can't you do that on your own device? Trey?
Thank you very much, Pedro. Looking at the clock, I'm between you and lunch. But also, this is 10 years of work and 1 year of collaboration, and so I'm going to finish this presentation. If you want to get up and go out and get lunch, I will not be offended, but I will go quickly. So, let's just go on an upbeat note. You've been waiting. We're at, what is this, slide 33, and now we're going to talk about Y2K, because we said in the beginning, 2038 is not the same as Y2K, which is what a lot of people think. But who here was born in the 90s and remembers this hit album from 1999? Hit Me Baby One More Time is what we're about to get. So I did some research. The first programmer, what happened in 1999, Y2K, was basically some programmers were trying to save memory back when memory was expensive. They coded, I'm sorry, some of us need this. They coded the year, not as 4 digits, but as 2, which in 1950, when RAM was super heckin' expensive, was clever. but like a design pattern, this got copied. And probably somewhere in the 60s or 70s, somebody knew 2000 was coming and said something in a meeting. But by 1993, we get this 3-page article in Computer World magazine. Is it still around? I don't know. So Peter de Jager writes this article on Doomsday 2000, and this sparks a huge amount of international concern because, I would add, there was something different. 2038 happens at the 19th of January at 3:14:07 a.m., UTC. That's not a clear marker. Where we had a millennial rollover happening. Every other religion in the world was looking for their Messiah to come back. Every government was looking out for acts of terrorism. We were really preparing for Y2K to be a kind of hybrid attack on the world. There was a lot of pressure on government, and government acted. Y2K wasn't solved, though, by code alone. It was solved by coordination. We had national czars, we had task forces, we had even the UN set up a coordination center with over 120 countries. Did you know, as I learned, that for a few weeks before and after the Y2K rollover, the US and Russia maintained a joint early missile warning center in Colorado to prevent the outbreak of World War III? So we mobilized, and we spent real money. How much money did we spend? Let's say a lot. So trying to put a ballpark on this, global Y2K spending was staggering. Adjusted for today's dollars, between $900 billion and $1.8 trillion, mostly on prevention. Now, did somebody somewhere have a printer that they really hated, that they said, it doesn't have a safe for Y2K sticker on it, give me a new printer? Sure, there was waste in there. We bought new servers and printers, but we mostly bought continuity with time, money, patching code, and coordination. It was expensive, but we survived because the world, we collectively chose to pay up front and get in front of the problem. The paradox, though, is that the success of the Y2K remediation effort made the return on investment invisible to the public. And so people came away with the impression that Y2K was a fraud and a giant waste of money. Those were different times. It was still a lot of money. 2038 prep is somehow harder. And so we're going to take a moment to say, maybe you came here with the idea in your head, oh, they're going to talk about the 2038 problem. I know about that. Hopefully we've opened up the frame for you a little bit. Hopefully now you're like, I have a better sense of what this problem feels like. So let's ask ourselves, is this problem solvable? Because if not, let's go drink, right? I can just say, let's lunchtime. So the thing is, technically it's solvable. We know the fixes. We need to do some inventory, we need to widen counters, we need to roll out some protocols and some updates of code. But deploying them across the installed base globally is slow. IPv6 is a good proof of this. So we also have this complicating factor of 2036 and 2038 colliding in the same decade, less than 2 years apart. So depending on how we respond to the 2036 thing, depending on how much we're still cleaning up a mess, by 2038, that's kind of hard to factor into our modeling. Also, the scale of the embedded device landscape, the fragmented standards ecosystem, and the economic incentives and the diplomatic bad blood between nation states right now all block a clean, coordinated Y2K style fix. However, there is hope. If we admit the scale and we act together, we can still mitigate the worst. So, Brittany is a perfectly imperfect analogy. A system can look rock solid until it suddenly collapses in public. Infrastructure works the same way. It's stable until it isn't, especially consensus-based infrastructure. And not all failures hit us at the same speed. That is why triage by tempo is the only sane strategy. Life safety comes first. If your medical devices kick out, somebody dies. If your air traffic control system desyncs, somebody dies. Command and control is next. Whether you're talking about nuclear deterrence or live ops, a false timestamp can escalate a crisis instantly. Then critical infrastructure, your power, your water, your transport, your food. Cascades can multiply, people can get hurt and die in these. And then finally, of course, we have to uphold our economic systems. Markets and supply chains, though, unravel in slower motion than a breathing machine in a hospital. You lose your money first, and others you lose lives. So the key here is triage by stability. Life, safety, defense stability, and infrastructure integrity come before economic fallout. Our reality will do the triage for us. And may I say, profound respect to Brittany. She showed us what resilience in a shitstorm really looks like. It isn't pretty, it's messy. So now, let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Admitting all of this means admitting that we have some brittle foundations to our technology stack. Look, there's Amelia Earhart smiling beside the 800-pound gorilla in the room. This is us. The problem is absurdly visible, and we smile as if it isn't there. So let's talk about the gorilla. In the right rooms, since I was this tall, people have known about 2038 since the 90s, but admitting it is hard. No leader wants to stand up and say billions of devices will fail and we can't fix them all in time. Politically, it's safer to stay silent. Y2K was different. It carried this millennial dread, prophecy, cult, and conspiracies. Governments had to be seen as acting, and so they acted. 2038 lacks this biblical number. It doesn't have a countdown drumbeat. It's not in the minds of most people. It's just fatigue, burnout. Meanwhile, our engineers are retiring, their knowledge is vanishing, and this delay doesn't buy us time, it burns our chances. At the same time, over the last 25 years, we've converged our entire planetary communications infrastructure onto internet protocols. This has given us efficiency and economic advantages, but it's also created single points of failure at unprecedented historical scale. When the internet has timing problems, where is our fallback communication plane? Remediation on this isn't optional. Think about climate change. This affects everyone, everywhere. Lots of people, when I talk to this problem of 2038, make the direct comparison to climate change. Here's a key difference, though. Climate change doesn't hit everywhere all at once, and the 2038 problem does. So I would say, as we go further into the direction of chasing gorillas, politics rewards silence. Physics doesn't. Physics doesn't negotiate. So we have this supply chain gorilla on the rooftop. A hard fact is that between 70 and 90% of our critical technology still depends on Asian supply chain today, which is not meant as attack on anyone, simply stating a fact. So resilience isn't just about protocols, it's also about the parts that we need. If we need to replace things in our fielded landscape, those parts have to come from somewhere. And the hard truth is that most of our system guts still trace back to Asia, whether it's Taiwan for semiconductors or China for rare earths, batteries, and assembly. Even a made in Europe or made in USA device is still mostly Asian supply chain today. This is not politics, it's physics. And so, if you will entertain this thought experiment, like imagine a game show with 3 doors. You got to choose one. Door 1 is accept the supply chain dependency. This is going to take we're going to take a huge economic hit as we remediate this. We could try some kind of backroom stockpiling. We're going to go buy a bunch of chips and printed circuit boards and stick them in a warehouse and hope that that's the right stuff. But this backfires for all kinds of reasons I'd be happy to have a sidebar in. Then there's door number 3, which is pursuing diplomatic coordination, which is in theory the best approach we could take, and that's sort of applying the playbook of Y2K, but these are different times. So that may not be feasible fully in the same way in today's fractured geopolitical landscape. This is why the governments are staying silent, because every option looks politically toxic. But the thing is, this King Kong isn't going to climb down by himself. It's up to us to deal with him. And so now let's come back home. Let's talk about Belgium. Belgium may look small, but it has huge systemic impact on the world. There's a lot of critical infrastructure here that's not just Belgian, whether it's ports, grids, medical system, banking. A lot of Europe and the world is wired straight into Belgium for historical reasons. There are choke points of power here, whether SWIFT, NATO, the EU, Eurocontrol, identity. There's a company in Belgium that manufactures many of the passports and identity cards of the world's nations, and I bet you maybe didn't all know that. So a timestamp failure here, whether in crisis, a test gone wrong, hybrid conflict, like to an adversary, this would offer significant instant advantage across multiple critical sectors. And so shocks here could cascade fast. I would submit to you that Belgium isn't just vulnerable to this, but in some sense you might consider it a global stress test shaped like a country, because how Belgium responds to this will set the tone for Europe, just as with NIS and NIS2 and other areas where Belgium continues to lead in the rollout of European issues and national legislation. Belgium always tries to lead. There's a real opportunity here, but also a responsibility. Belgium's response will set the tone of the global and the European conversation on this. Who inherits our failures, though? There's too many words on this slide. Sorry, I stayed up too late. Anyway, the point is, imagine you're a company and you have a warehouse full of routers that you plan to go sell. And then you find out those routers don't work in 10 or 12 years, and you can't just patch it. What are you going to do? Are you going to go dump those in the Mariana Trench and take a tax write-off? Are you going to try to find somebody to sell those to? And so I would submit to you that in a situation where I can go walk through a duty-free at Zaventem, pick up a brand new smartwatch today from a top manufacturer, and I know it doesn't work. I know I can make it crash. If that's happening today, we're still making the problem worse here in Belgium. And when we wake up and realize that, unscrupulous companies are going to try to dump equipment in the developing world, and that should not happen for all kinds of reasons. This is my favorite slide. This is on defense, geopolitics. It used to be a big, long arc, but we ran out of time. It's now Macaulay's big, gorgeous head. Guess what? We might wish we were home alone, but we are not. We need to prepare sort of our walls at the same time that other people are metaphorically firing a cannon at our walls. So we need to think in terms of the impact this has on nuclear deterrence, specifically various modes of deployment, detection, avionics. You may not know the F-22 fighter, but when that first went out to fly a squadron of them over the international date line, back about 10 years ago or so, when they flew over the international date line, a sign error in their firmware caused all their avionics to crash. And so they had to go back and land manually, not on autopilot, wait on some island in the Pacific until the vendor could figure out, work out a patch, come patch all the aircraft in the squadron of F-22s, recertify them, and they could continue on the mission. So I'm not just making this up. That was exactly this kind of coding issue. The first to fix this also may gain a decisive advantage. So I will point out, competition is going to screw us. Coordination and cooperation is the only path forward, and people are going to try to gain advantage from this. We have less than 50 quarters remaining. So it's hard to think when you're trying not to sink. But unlike this lovely band on the Titanic, we are attempting to measure the size of the iceberg out in front of us. We know it's under the water, and we're scanning ahead. So we think now, while we're still afloat, what can we do? So technically, think back to Sweden. They treat their time as critical infrastructure. This is a good example for us. Next, we want to test our systems. These silent rollover failures, they don't just announce themselves and send a letter. They show up only in integration tests sometimes. Test beds are the way to catch these early. If you have a national or a company test bed, figure out how to get that going. Know your assets. Most organizations have not begun any type of inventory on this issue. Discovery and inventory are half the battle, and they are the first half. Next, harden in layers. As Pedro showed clearly, this issue is not an issue in 2038. You can manipulate the time signal on many networks and bring this attack surface forward today. So consider replacing your old NTP, maybe with some NTS. Consider anchoring on on-premise clocks, maybe some rubidium or cesium backup, so your GPS loss may not be fatal. So at least if somebody tries to fuck with your GPS, you can know. Harden in layers. Isolate your control plane. You shouldn't be syncing time for critical infrastructure to the internet. This should be treated like management band. Clean up if you are syncing to the internet. For God's sake, don't use unauthenticated Stratum X randos that might poison your infrastructure. At least know what you're time syncing to. Resilience is not just a patch you're going to apply in 2037. It is a discipline you start building today. If I may say, one takeaway, what to do technically, treat time with as much care as you would treat DNS in your infrastructure. Here's what to do about policy and procurement. We talked about risks. This is lined up who here knows TLP, the traffic light protocol? TLP red, TLP amber, TLP green. If you don't know, we should do a lightning talk on that. So this is basically top secret. This is more don't talk about it outside the group. This is talk about it in the group. Don't talk about it publicly. So these are 3 frames for policy response. It's past lunchtime, and this is a hacker talk, not a policy talk. But the point is, this is a slide for some people in this room, and we can talk offline. Money still talks. Perhaps it's worth sharing this with some politician upstream from you. And so I come to this slide. Spend recovery and stewardship. Story time. I did pilot training years ago, and I was told, well, first of all, I need to tell you something. Has anybody ever seen an airplane in a movie do a spin where it just like goes down on the ground, splat? So a thing to know about spins, any aircraft can get into a spin. It's not something you want to do on purpose. And when you get into a spin, there's the ground. Like your distance to the ground is the main factor. But also, if you do everything right and you want to get out of the spin, you have to do it above a certain altitude because the aircraft still has to spin for a while before it recovers. So there's this concept of a minimum safety altitude. So when I was doing my pilot training, my instructor said, no, we're not going to do spin training. Too many people died in practice and they stopped doing it. But my dad, who's a former Air Force Academy instructor pilot, jet pilot, he said, no son of mine is going to be a pilot without doing spin training. And so he was like 65 or 68 at the time. We went up in this old single engine. I could tell the whole story, but spins are fucking terrifying. It's just so terrifying. The ground is rushing at you, everything is spinning, your dials are spinning, your controls aren't working right. You just know you're gonna die at the most basic level. So in all that chaos, there is only one way out. You have to do the specific procedure. You have to pull your power back to idle, adjust your ailerons to neutral, figure out which direction you're spinning, apply an opposite amount of control on the rudder to try to stop the spin, push your elevator forward, just pull it back, and wait. And you have timing and sequence in all of this, and meanwhile, you feel like all you want to do is like shit your pants and call out to Jesus or something. So, this is a metaphor for disciplined action, for drills, but let me extend this just a while more. I also asked my dad, who's a former airline pilot, how is it that you carry the moral weight of all the passengers behind you? When you go to land the plane, aren't you thinking about, all their families are going to be so sad if I crash the plane? And he said, no, son, it's easy. You're in the front. Wherever the plane goes, you get there first. And so you focus on seeing your family again. So who here flew to BruCON? Did anybody fly? So did you notice the stewards, the people who showed you how to buckle your seatbelt, how to blow up your life vest? You remember them? I would submit to you that the internet doesn't have a cockpit. That's where this whole metaphor breaks down. You say, there is no cockpit. It's a distributed system. It's consensus-based. It's multilateral. Nobody owns it. That's a feature, not a bug. This is true. So I'm not saying we're the pilots of our digital infrastructure. I'm saying we're the stewards. And it may be that we do our job so well that the public doesn't notice on 2038. It may be that we're lucky and everybody thinks this is a giant waste of time in 2039 because nothing happened. But let me tell you something. Some people will notice. We will notice. The aircraft is spinning. We've showed you the math. The airframe is locked into the spin. We've showed you some indications of what to do. We've showed you why remediation is not optional and why we think there's still time for coordinated action. And so, in closing, I say, inventory, test, demand proof, ITD, inventory, test, demand proof, not later, now. Please don't wait to be told. You have been told. You have been told. And so with that, we don't really have time for Q&A, I don't think, but we tried very hard to allow time. Here's our contact information. Remember, don't just go setting a clock on something that you don't own or that is really important, because this could actually do something wacky that you don't expect. Yeah. Also remember, every resilient system begins with a courageous human who refuses to shut up in a meeting. So if you come away from this talk and you start talking about this at work and people tell you, but 2038 is 12 years away, you tell them it's less than 50 quarters and you tell them that it's here today. If we have time for questions, we'd take questions.
Thank you.
Does anybody have a question? Or is everybody hungry? Otherwise, I invite you to come to Trey and Pedro after the talk downstairs.
Oh, sorry. The Epochalypse project is like this open source thing we're doing. So if you're interested, we also have stickers. We're happy to hand out stickers, talk to you on the break. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No problem. Lunch downstairs, and we'll be back at 1:30.